How do you do closed captioning? Where's that?
So last time somebody asked for it and I didn't have it enabled.
Oh,
So this time I went into Zoom and like the settings
okay.
and found it.
Beautiful.
You have
That's
to go
important.
into your account. You can't add it while an active Zoom meeting is happening.
All right. Excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
All right, what do you think? Should we go ahead and get started? Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Tara Karaim. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the program manager of grants at ArtsKC. Before we get started today, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction as to how these workshops came about and what we hope to accomplish. So in building a relationship with Community Capital Fund, we identified that both of our organizations, ArtsKC and CCF, we want to help artists get access to capital. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the Inspiration Grant at ArtsKC. However, you may not be aware of the opportunities that are available at CCF. So we have Phyllis Hardwick here today to answer any questions about that. Our first workshop really focused on how to build a budget for funding applications, and it went great. If you missed it, we did record it, so I have that link I can send to you if you'd like. Let me know. But we also identified that we want to help artists gain the knowledge to best utilize any capital they do secure. Thus, the idea for this workshop came about concerning the legal basics of any creative business endeavors. Our goal is that artists feel confident gaining and retaining capital or using capital. And we hope to continue to offer service in these areas as our partnership develops and to continue to be a resource for artists in Kansas City. So with that, I'd like to pass the torch to Phyllis Hardwick from Community Capital Fund to introduce herself. And then we'll have Danielle Merrick from Kansas City Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts take the floor.
Thanks. I appreciate that introduction. And my name is Phyllis Hardwick. I'm Executive Director of Community Capital Fund. We support neighborhoods. And so that means that our neighborhoods support artists. I don't need to probably tell many artists on this call that you can't really think through community revitalization. You can't really think through placemaking. You can't really think through how we can better collaborate and come together as residents, as communities, without thinking as the opportunity of leveraging art to those ends. And so artists have always been connected to Community Capital Fund in one way or another, whether that's participating in our community development workshop, which is actually coming up for its 10th year this year, be on the lookout for that information, and partnering with our neighborhoods and thinking through some of those challenges around blight remediation, artwork installation, et cetera. Or if it's actually been a recipient of our Neighborhood Rising Fund, which actually is a fund that we have open that is for community support and community-based organizations. And if you're a nonprofit based art maker or arts practice, then you'll be eligible for that grant. But one thing that we've seen both in ArtsKC and over here at CCF is that there's always an opportunity to give more resources in the toolkit so that artists can get additional types of capital. Grant-based capital is one of, is the only form that's frankly free. You don't have to pay me back. There may be some reporting requirements. But what I found is that there can sometimes be challenges around budgeting and legal structuring that can sometimes make it difficult for artists to achieve that type of grant-based capital. So I'm excited that you're here today because hopefully it's adding more resources into your toolkit so you can get more opportunities to be able to grow your practice and grow your potentially business as an artist. So I'll be here on the call to pop in and answer any questions on that side as we continue. But thank you all so much for being here today and making time to invest in yourself and growing our communities and neighborhoods here in Kansas City.
I think I'm just supposed to go now.
Thank you. I was trying to unmute. Yeah, thank you, Phyllis. Yeah, go ahead, Danielle.
So I'm Danielle Merrick. I actually recognize a lot of you guys. You've either been at events that I've been at and done presentations at before, or I've seen you doing like artworks or ArtsKC or the Artist Inc. So I've seen like a lot of these faces before. So some of this might be really redundant for some of you, especially if you've seen me before. But I'm Danny Merrick. I'm the executive director of the Kansas City Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts. I'm also a law professor at UMKC School of Law. My practice area is business, tax, contracts, and intellectual property. I work with nothing but small business and low income entrepreneurs and artists. So I work with you every day. That's all I work with is small startup people. Never working with big corporations. I kind of hate big corporations. So I'm only working with small startup people all the time. So I'm very familiar with a lot of the stuff that faces you. I'm wearing a little Irish t-shirt today in honors of St. Patrick's Day. So I'm a little dressed down for the occasion, though most people that know me in person know that I take business casual way to the casual side anyway. So this isn't completely out of character for me. I usually keep these types of presentations super informal. So if you've got questions, just put them in chat, raise your hand. I can hop down a bunny trail and talk about something and come back, no problem. So I like to make sure that I'm meeting the audience where they are and getting your questions answered, as opposed to just spouting a bunch of information at you. The other thing is that we have a very limited amount of time here. So the stuff that I am telling you, I literally could take any of these topics and talk for 2 or 3 hours on every single one of these topics and still only be scratching the surface. So most of what is probably going to happen today is you are going to come away with more questions than you have answers. It's going to help generate what types of questions you should maybe be asking and where you need to have additional people assist you. KCVLA does a free 45-minute consultation for artists every third Thursday of the month. We do that in conjunction with both the Interurban Art House and the Kansas City Artists Coalition. Pre-pandemic, we were doing those in person. Right now, we're still doing those via Zoom. I'm not sure when we're going to go move them back to in person. So far, people have this kind of mixed thing where they have Zoom fatigue, but yet at the same time, they sure like not having to drive for a 45-minute meeting to leave again. So I'm not really sure when we're going to put those back on in person, but for right now, they're free. There's no cost to you. You just have to sign up for an appointment slot, and it's 45 minutes to talk with an attorney. It's usually me, but if you've got something and I know it's not in my wheelhouse, I will recruit someone else to talk to you about it. So how I'm going to start today, I'm going to talk about some of the financial stuff related to running art as a business, and then talk about both for-profit and non-for-profit formation, or what we call in the legal sphere, choice of entity. So first, on the financial side, the second that any of you have accepted money for artwork that you have done, you have become a business, whether you ever wanted to or not. So even if that happened when you were 17 and you sold a canvas to a friend of yours that for something that you had created, you became a business. So you all are probably a business in some capacity because of the fact that you are selling your artwork in some capacity. So when we talk about people who are businesses, one of the main tenets of that idea is any money that comes into you. And that means any source, whether you sell something, get a loan, get a grant, etc., that is income. The IRS considers that income to you as the person, and you have to report that on your income tax return. The reason that I mention this is that I run into artists all the time that receive a grant and do not realize that is considered income that they're going to have to pay taxes on, and then are not prepared when their tax bill hits in April, when all of a sudden they have to pay money on this extra money that they got that they didn't realize that they were going to have to pay money on it. I have the same problem happen when people do GoFundMe's or Kickstarters or things like that. They all of a sudden have income they were not realizing they were going to have to pay taxes on. So the way that we have to treat that is any money that you come in is income. Now, how you combat having to pay taxes on all of that is by having business expenses. And so for all of you, you're probably going to end up filing what's known as a Schedule C, C as in cat, and a Schedule SE. SE stands for self-employment. So Schedule C is where we list all of our business income and expenses. So that grant you get, any money that you get from commissions, any money you get from selling your work at an art fair, all of those things, that's your income on Schedule C. Then on Schedule C, you also get to list out all your expenses. So maybe you had to buy a special printer for something that you were doing, or maybe you had to buy an upgraded computer. Maybe you needed to buy tax preparation software. Maybe all of these things are potential business expenses. And so some businesses will have, let's say they made $5,000 in business income, they might have $3,000 of business expenses, so that then there's only $2,000 left over at the end. And that $2,000 is then what they pay income tax on, as opposed to the full $5,000. So for you who get grants or you get any income from other places, what a lot of artists that I meet with struggle with is keeping track of their expenses. And keeping track of your expenses is important, because then you're able to write them off against your business income. And also, you want to know how much money you're having to spend on the projects that you're engaging in. Now, related to that, the question that I then always get is, what's the best way to keep track of my income and expenses? And the standard answer I give is the one you will actually use. So if that is a ledger, an old school ledger book, great. If that is a QuickBooks system or Mint or something like that, great. Whatever you're going to use is what you should use. There's no specific format that you need to be keeping track of this stuff in. It's just whatever you're going to use, that you're actually going to use, is what's important. One of the things that I do as running a nonprofit myself is every time I go to a store and I buy something that is going to be an expense for the nonprofit, when I get into the car, I take a picture of the receipt with my phone and I upload that to Dropbox for the month and the year that that receipt occurred. And then that way I already have a list of all those receipts right there in a picture. And then I have everything going into Mint, which then pulls things and you can categorize it. Mint is the free version for personal use for QuickBooks. It's online based. It doesn't have any software. It's just up in the cloud. So, you're going to need to be keeping track of your income and expenses. Those will all go onto your Schedule C. Your Schedule SE is because anyone who is a small business owner has to pay self-employment tax on their income of their business. So the reason is that when you're going to work at McDonald's or whatever, you're a W-2 employee. And so they're withholding part of the taxes for you, and then you're paying part of the taxes. When you're self-employed, you are both the employer and the employee. So you've got to pay both halves of that tax. And where that's recorded is on the self-employment tax section of the Form SE. It's about 15.3%. So what I generally tell my artists is that if you can swing it, every time you get income from any source related to your art, if you can hold back about 15.3%, you are going to be much better off once we come to April. Most artists and most self-employed individuals do remit what's known as estimated taxes. And so that means that once a quarter, you send money to the federal government based on what you're guesstimating is your quarterly tax. That's that 15.3%. If you can send that every quarter, when you get to April, you might still owe money, but you're not going to necessarily owe like $11,000 at the end of April, which is completely shocking and very difficult to deal with. Does anybody have any questions about my just like hard hit general tax thing before I move into some choice of entity stuff? All right, so for choice of entity, we have two different tracks when we're talking about choice of entity. We have for-profit and not-for-profit. I'm going to start with not-for-profit because not-for-profit is super complicated, but it's kind of a little bit easier to talk about on the first hand. So not-for-profit can be a viable option for your art career, depending on what you're trying to do. The thing with not-for-profit is that it has to be charitable. And so an art gallery cannot necessarily be a not-for-profit because it's not designed just to promote arts awareness. It's designed to make a profit by selling that artwork. But a theater company that is putting on productions, like let's say it's a theater company that's an all BIPOC theater company, and it's putting on all BIPOC productions, there is a charitable benefit there to promoting BIPOC productions and doing that in the community. And even though they're collecting ticket sales for that, their primary purpose is to promote and put on BIPOC works. So you can have a charitable thing depending on what you're doing, but you need to make sure that what you're doing is charitable. One of the misconceptions that people have, well, there's two, is one is that if what I'm trying to do doesn't make money, it's a nonprofit. No, that just means it's a bad business idea. It doesn't mean it's a nonprofit. It doesn't mean it's charitable. It just means it's not going to make you any money for whatever reason. The other thing is that people have this misconception that nonprofits can't make money. Nonprofits can make money, and we do want nonprofits to make money because we want nonprofits to be self-sustaining. So one of the examples of a nonprofit that makes money hand over fist is the NCAA is a nonprofit. Their charitable purpose is to promote amateur sports competition. Now, you know, they're making money hand over fist, right? I mean, we see all the NCAA stuff, March Madness is going on right now, right? But they're allowed to make money. They just have to maybe pay what's known as UBIT, which is unrelated business income tax, on some of the money that they're making that is not related to their charitable purpose. So if once you've determined if what you're doing is potentially charitable and you are interested in forming a nonprofit, in Kansas and Missouri, the requirements are somewhat similar. You have to file an Articles of Incorporation with the Secretary of State. Missouri and Kansas both require you to have a board of directors. Missouri requires that you have to have 3 at all times. Kansas requires 1. You have to have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. Those can be 3 different persons serving 3 different roles, or it can be 1 person serving all 3 roles. Those articles of incorporation are filed with the Secretary of State. The cost for doing that is very low. It's $25 or $35, or depending on the state. You then have to have bylaws, which is kind of a contract that governs how the nonprofit is going to run. A conflict of interest policy, which is dealing with if somebody has a personal interest in something, they have to disclose it. Hey, I'm a graphic designer and I'm offering to do the logo for you. And I'm also going to recuse myself. I'm going to leave the room and not vote on it. And that's what your conflict of interest policy does. One of the things that's important to remember is that a non-for-profit is not owned by any individual person or group of persons. It's owned by the taxpayer of the state in which it is incorporated. So that means if whatever you're wanting to do is your big baby, like you really want a lot of control over it and you never want anyone else to have control over it, do not form a nonprofit. You can form a nonprofit, and even though you're the founder, the visionary, the person who started it all, if your board of directors ultimately determines that you are not a good fit for that, they have to act in the best interest of the nonprofit, and they can and will oust you. So if you need a lot of control, a nonprofit is not the way to go. The other thing about nonprofit is once you form a nonprofit corporation in Missouri or Kansas, that does not make it automatically tax exempt. You have to apply for tax exempt status with the Internal Revenue Service. That's the part that's expensive and a little bit more complicated. That form requires a lot of information about your purposes and your budget and things like that. And then the IRS charges somewhere between $250 and $600 to have you have the privilege of applying for that, which they use as a user's fee. So even if they reject your application, they just keep your money. And then it takes them several months to go ahead and decide whether or not you're a charitable nonprofit. If they make the determination that you're a charitable nonprofit, you will be exempt from taxes. And you will also have the ability that if anybody donates materials to you, gives you a grant, et cetera, that whoever gives you those things would actually be able to deduct those things from their taxes as well. That's a crash course in nonprofit. Does anybody have any questions about nonprofit stuff?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So when you say does not have to pay any taxes, the sales tax piece is separate. So like, for example, when we were doing our construction, we had to pay sales tax on all the materials that we purchased. We were not exempt from paying sales tax on anything. And that super hard to get, or what?
So Nicole brings up a good point. When I say you don't have to pay any taxes, I'm talking about income taxes. But yes, withholding taxes, if you have employees, you're still subject to as a nonprofit, and sales tax, you're still potentially subject to. Missouri and Kansas handle sales tax exemptions differently. Missouri, and this is my experience with everything with Missouri and Kansas, and I live in Kansas, so I can be as disparaging about Kansas as I want. Missouri and Kansas handle it very differently. Missouri is basically like, oh, your nonprofit, the IRS gave you a tax exempt status, fine, you're tax exempt for us too. We're cool with that. Here you go. Kansas is like, well, unless you're a church or a hospital or a school, we're not going to give you a tax exempt status unless you jump through like a million hoops, appeal it like 20 times, hire an attorney and pay us a bunch of money to appeal it more, and then finally get it. So,
so I'm not crazy. This is really happening.
Yes, this is really happening. Kansas is just being kind of an asshole about it. And they're like, we're not giving tax exempt status to anybody. They're basically like the federal government. They're like, we don't care what the feds did. We're Kansas. We can do whatever we want. And so they're like, we're not giving you tax exempt status. So Kansas is giving you tax exempt status from an income standpoint, but they pretty much do not grant sales tax exemptions except to churches, hospitals, and schools, except in very limited occasions. So that is why, Nicole, you guys ended up having to pay sales tax on a bunch of stuff, is because you were in Kansas. Now, if you were doing the same thing in Missouri, Missouri would be like, oh, you're tax exempt, here you go, here's a certificate. Oh, and you never have to renew it. It's for the life of the organization. Just take it and go. Go. Don't talk to us anymore. You're tax exempt, go. And so Missouri would be fine with all of that. And you wouldn't have had to have paid sales tax on all of that. You would have just been exempt. So
the reality is good to know.
Yeah. So,
rarely in March does the Missouri side win anything, but I do appreciate that has been my experience as a nonprofit over here in Missouri, that's been pretty easy. There can be some hoops depending upon the company you're using. So for instance, Best Buy, Amazon, a lot of them will have specific hoops, but Danielle, while you're talking about nonprofits, and everything you said has been so spot on, I wish I could have recorded it. Actually, we are recording this, so I will probably be able to forward that to some folks. One request I get, and I do run a fiscal sponsorship organization, and I know ArtsKC also does some fiscal sponsorship work. So can you touch on that briefly? Because I do think that can sometimes be a viable option if you want to be a for-profit business, but you have a project or an idea that you think is appropriate for community benefit.
Yes, fiscal sponsorship is like the best. I love fiscal sponsorship. I am constantly trying to get new small nonprofits to just do fiscal sponsorship before they apply for tax exempt status. Fiscal sponsorship is great because you have an established organization that is essentially letting you use their tax exempt status to collect donations on your behalf for your use. Now, it's usually a contractual relationship, as it should be. And the contract is basically saying, okay, little small nonprofit or for-profit project thing that needs to do this thing. You have some reporting requirements to us, and you have to promise that you're not going to violate our tax exempt status by going off and doing, crazy stuff that we didn't agree to. And in exchange, we're going to let you use our tax exempt status, and you're going to pay us an administrative fee because now we have all this extra paperwork, and we want a percentage of whatever money you raise. For a small nonprofit corporation or even a project arm, there is no prohibition or limit on how long you can be under fiscal sponsorship. If you have a good working contractual relationship with whoever your sponsor is, that relationship can literally go on for years. It doesn't have to be a one-off. It doesn't have to be, I do this for 3 months and then I don't do it. You can do this indefinitely. The benefit for a very small startup nonprofit or for a project is that a lot of my small startup nonprofits, they don't really actually know where their money is going to come from. They don't really know how they're going to fund their programming. They've got some guesses, they've got some inclinations, but they have not had the chance to have the rubber meet the road and go, well, now I've gone out, I've solicited these donations, and this is how I get money. Doing a fiscal sponsorship means they can spend the $25, $35 to form a nonprofit corporation. They don't have to spend the $250 to $600 doing a tax exempt status application, but they can go hit the ground running and start running their program using this fiscal sponsorship. That way, they get to test proof of concept. They get to find out if they actually can raise money. Because here's the reality. In good times or bad, only 1% of the GDP goes to nonprofits and donations. So that means even when people are making money hand over fist, or when people are not making money, they still only get 1% of the GDP. And when there's a tragedy, people don't give more, they shift their giving. So like all this stuff raising money for Ukraine, that's not people giving more. They're just not going to give to Wayside Waifs this year, or they're not going to give to Interurban Art House. They're instead going to give to Ukraine. And so that means that you've got every new nonprofit is competing for an ever smaller, shrinking piece of the same piece of pie. Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership did a study several years ago. What it results into in the Kansas City metro area is that every nonprofit's competing for the same 41 individual donors, roughly. In addition to that, the average budget for a nonprofit in the Kansas City, Missouri area is $5,000. So that means that you've got big nonprofits, but most of your nonprofits are little, like one person, two person, we're just doing good in the community. We're not even getting paid to do it. We're just volunteering. We're getting just enough money to put the good back into the community, and that is it. If you're trying to run a theater company and you don't know where your money's coming from, and you don't know if people are going to come to your shows, a fiscal sponsor is a great way to test that concept. If you find out that no one will come to your shows and no one will fund them, you kind of know that even though it sucks, your idea for a theater company is not sustainable, right? It's just not going to get off the ground. So I love fiscal sponsorship. If you can find a good fiscal sponsor, it is something that you should absolutely take advantage of. And Fractured Atlas is mentioned in the comments, and it is definitely a good national one. But you can, there are lots of local organizations that are willing to enter into fiscal sponsorship agreements as well. Phyllis, did I hit on what you wanted me to hit on?
You sure did. I mean, I also am now second guessing about sharing this video though, because I do have some sponsored orgs that I do want to leave me, but I'm realizing I made the home a little too nice, right? Like I'm paying the light bill, the refrigerator is stocked. And so sometimes your sponsored org does want you to be on a path to independence and eventually securing your own 501c3 status. But I would underscore everything you said. I think it can be a really great arrangement for a lot of different purposes if you want to do community good. Just making sure that there's a aligned mission between you and your sponsored org is critical.
Yeah. And where I see more of the long-term fiscal sponsorship setups is where you've got like a homeless shelter who wants to provide job service training, but the homeless shelter can't raise money to do the job service training. So they fiscally sponsor a nonprofit to raise money for the job service training. And the homeless shelter then gets to expand their programming without expanding their budget. And that's where I see those longer term partnerships really going on.
I think that, yep, that is a great structure and arrangement for those long-term partnerships. I would agree.
Yeah. So any other comments or questions on nonprofit before I do a very crash course on for-profit?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So I run a small theater company. We have been fiscally sponsored through Fractured Atlas for years. We were pretty small for ages. It was about just me. We would do 1 or 2 shows a year. So actually I didn't even have an LLC to begin with or anything. It was just filed just under me.
Okay.
I just recently created an LLC for the company. What I'm hearing now is that I actually could have done and I'm in Missouri. I could have actually done a not-for-profit organization and still done fractured atlas. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
that is
And
correct.
should I reorganize under as a not-for-profit?
Probably.
Okay.
Probably. So I would suggest, honestly, you sign up for one of the 45-minute sessions, because there's a lot of like questions I would need to ask you to kind of get a little bit more information to suss out what would be the best course of action. An LLC can be a nonprofit and can be taxed as a tax exempt organization, as a charity. It's just a little bit, the IRS looks at those a little bit more closely because an LLC is technically a for-profit entity normally, but it's not impossible to have an LLC become a nonprofit and have tax exempt status. So I would need to suss out some more information from you, but my gut is normally if you're going to stay as a nonprofit theater company, it would make more sense to form a nonprofit corporation and get a board of directors.
Okay.
But I can't tell you with all authority that that's absolutely true without having a longer conversation with you.
Okay, great.
Which I am happy to have.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Oh,
Hi, Danny, I have a question. So I think Floor put a link in the chat. Is that the report you were talking about?
that is from the Block School of Business. So probably
Okay,
it.
awesome. Thank you, Floor, for putting that in there. I was just thinking that I wanted to.
Yeah,
copy.
it looks like the 2021. I think they do it every 2 years. So it may be that it hasn't come out again yet.
Mm.
Yes, Chris, you're right. How much control Kevin wants to maintain is also a factor. Yes, because if Kevin makes a nonprofit corporation, Kevin could potentially get kicked out of his nonprofit corporation, which he may or may not want to have happen.
Can I say something? Can I say something about that? Okay, so I'm the founder of Interurban Art House, and I think that that founder position really, you can begin something, but you have to understand that this is a thing way beyond you. You're just tapping into a need and fulfilling a need. And I think that it's a very natural progression that the organization grows beyond you, and that you you rise to your level of incompetence, as I like to put it. So so that part of it, I think, really is a personality thing. If you are very resilient and sharing, being a being a founder and then letting go over time appropriately is beautiful. It's very similar to raising a kid.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that if you are on the idea that you're wanting a nonprofit, there is kind of the mission is bigger than me sort of thing. And that to me is a soul searching thing. And I have certain clients that I work with that are like, yes, mission is bigger. And then I have certain clients who they're not there yet on their personal journey. It is very much, this is my thing. And I own it and I want to control it and I want to own it. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that position either. It's more of a thing where you've got to understand if you are moving in that nonprofit direction and you have that position, those positions they're in conflict with one another, and it could be something that will bite you in the butt. All right, any other nonprofit things? I saw Jerry unmute, but I don't know if Jerry wants to ask a question.
No, I mistaken.
That's cool. I didn't want to move on if you were wanting to say something. All right, so for-profit. So for-profit, anytime we're talking about for-profit, there's two things we're considering. We're considering business structure and we're considering tax structure. Now, most people like conflate this all together into this mismatch or whatever, but lawyers, we're thinking of it as two different things. Accountants have their own position on it, which I don't entirely agree with. but no lawyer agrees with an accountant hardly ever. So that's okay. So when we're thinking about it from a business structure setting, the first thing lawyers look at is we look at, well, how many people are involved in the business? If it's one person involved in the business versus more than one person, we treat those very differently. If there's one person involved in the business and one owner of the business, who's going to argue with you about making decisions? No one's going to care if you go out and spend $5,000 on paint, right? I mean, like, no one's going to argue with you. It's you. If there's more than one owner, now everything gets more complicated, right? We have to deal with, what if you guys don't agree on things? What if one of you becomes a drug addict? What if one of you gets divorced? What if one of you just disappears like Jerry Rafferty did for like a year off of the coast of England and just like disappeared for a year? I mean, it's like you have all these different things you have to account for. So that is the very different, we look at that very differently when there's more than one owner than if there is one owner. When there's one owner, most attorneys and even accountants would agree that our primary goal is to set you up in something that's going to provide you what's known as limited liability and provide you the best tax structure. Now, limited liability is where we're separating your business assets from your personal assets, so they're in two different buckets. There is a variety of ways you can get that. The most common way to get limited liability is to form what's known as a limited liability entity. Now, the one you've probably heard of the most commonly is what's known as an LLC, a limited liability company. But there are other limited liability entities. A corporation is a limited liability entity. A nonprofit corporation is a limited liability entity. So there are a variety of entities, but the most popular one is a limited liability company. The reason it's the most popular is it has the most flexibility. A limited liability entity has certain requirements. You have to form it with the Secretary of State. You have to hold yourself out as a limited liability company. You have to sign your documents as a limited liability company. You have to keep your business and personal funds separate, and you can't commingle them. So that means like you can't pay your rent, your personal rent or your mortgage from your business account, and you can't buy your art supplies with your personal account. So you've got to keep them completely separate. You have to have an operating agreement, which is an internal document that dictates how a non-profit or how a for-profit is run for a limited liability company. But there are limitations on what a limited liability company can do for you. For one thing, if you sign a personal guarantee, you are now personally liable for what you did. And that almost every credit card agreement, debit card agreement, commercial leases, most loans are going to have what's known as a personal guarantee. And it says, okay, the art business here is signing this, but Danny Merrick down here is signing this and saying, if art business can't pay it, Danny Merrick, the person, is going to pay it. And that's what's known as a personal guarantee. It also can't protect you from you have to do your sales tax that's your due and any withholding tax. And if you don't do those follow you, even if your LLC goes under. And then the last thing is it can't protect you from your own bad acts. So if you're in a predominantly service position and you're the only one doing the service, if your service is bad, you have a bad act related to your service, you can't hold up your limited liability company and be like, I have a limited liability company, you can't sue me. They're going to go, well, no, that was you, the person that did that. So for example, let's completely off the trail of being an artist. Well, they're artists in their own right. Let's pretend that I was a hairdresser. Let me assure you that this is a fantasy. There is no way that I could successfully do this.
I think you look fabulous.
Thanks. So let's pretend I'm a hairdresser and I take my lunch break and I head down to Free State Brewery and I have 8 beers at lunch. Now this is a feat that I've managed to like chug these. I have to be like chugging them to get down 8 beers at lunch. And I come back in the afternoon to cut more hair and I like snip somebody's ear because I'm clearly drunk if I've had 8 beers over my lunch hour, right? That's my own personal bad act. Even if I have an LLC, I can't be like, oops, you can't sue me. They're going to be like, your drunk, dumb ass came and chopped my ear off. That's your fault. And so they would sue me as the person, even though I had an LLC. So for a lot of individual artists that are working with nobody else and you're the one creating all the work and you're not hiring anybody to do anything, an LLC doesn't give you a lot of protection because you can't be protected from your own bad acts. If that is your situation, what I would advise is instead of forming a limited liability company, you get general business liability insurance. And general business liability insurance, some people call it CBL, commercial business, some call it GBL. You get an independent insurance agent. Don't just do American Family or State Farm because they can only underwrite those policies. And an independent insurance agent can underwrite from a variety of policies so they can actually save you money. And it's relatively inexpensive. You can usually get $1 million in coverage for between $300 and $500 a year. What that does for you is it gives you some measure of professionalism. I'm insured. It allows you to turn in covered claims if you have covered claims. It serves as capitalization. So most of the time from a legal standpoint in Missouri and Kansas, you're supposed to have your business be adequately capitalized. And they look at what your business bank account is. Well, maybe your business bank account's got $5 in it, but then you have $1 million insurance policy. They're like, oh, it's like you have $1 million, $1,005,005. And so they count it for capitalization, but then it also covers your cost of defense. So anyone can sue anyone for any reason at any time. And this way, if someone sues you, you're able to turn it into insurance and they appoint an attorney to represent you as opposed to you having to try to find someone to show up at court. I mean, because I could get off this call today and I could go down to the Jackson County Courthouse and file a suit for dog bite against any of you. None of you may even own a dog, and I clearly was not bitten on a Zoom call, but you're still going to have to show up and defend it. And that insurance can help cover that cost of defense. Where an LLC will help you is if you are working with other persons. So you're hiring independent contractors, you're hiring employees, you're doing joint ventures on combined work together. Then a limited liability is helping protect you from other people's bad acts. So your independent contractor that you hired is transporting your artwork from one location to the other and gets into a car accident. That helps protect you from his or her bad act instead of anything that you would have done. If there's more than one owner, always form an LLC. Every single time, no question, always form an LLC. If you are going into business with someone, even if you're doing some kind of joint artwork, be careful. The law can sometimes imply that there is a business together there as a partnership and imply liability in what's known as joint and several liability so that you both are equally liable. So if you're getting into any sort of arrangement with another artist, you need to get stuff in writing to protect yourself. So that's kind of like on the business side. The other side that we look at is the tax side. And the tax side, if you're the only owner of a business, the LLC or any of these disregarded entities are what's known, they're known as disregarded entities. And so the IRS says, LLC, we do not care about that. That's a state law thing. Don't talk to us about that. How many owners are in the business? And you go, 1, they're like, oh, you're a sole proprietor. 2, okay, you're a partnership. So they just put you as a sole proprietor or put you as a partnership unless you tell them otherwise. So for most of you, if you're working by yourself, from a tax standpoint, you're going to be considered what's known as a sole proprietor. A sole proprietor, all your tax obligation is going all the way back to the beginning, filing a Schedule C and a Schedule SE attached to your 1040 tax return. If they determine that you have asked them to tax you as something different, or there's more than one of you, now you have additional tax filing requirements. But most of you, if you're working individually, would be what's known as just a sole proprietor for tax purposes. Now, eventually, if you start hiring other people or you're making over $50,000 after expenses, there might be some reasons in the future to be changing your tax situation to be what's known as an S corporation. This is where accountants and attorneys start to argue a little bit. Accountants want you to be an S corporation from the second that you're born, and attorneys are like, what are you doing this for other than paying an accountant more money? So I usually use rule of thumb is if you are a sole proprietor, there is no reason to become an S corporation unless you are A, hiring other people, either as employees or independent contractors, or making $50,000 a year after expenses, because the tax savings that you'll get from an S corporation will not exceed your tax preparation fees that you're paying until you hit one of those two markers. So that's like my kind of general rule of thumb with that. If there's more than one ownership, they're going to tax you as a partnership as a default. Partnership is the most complicated tax reporting structure in the entire tax code. However, it is the most flexible for more than one owner. So for most small businesses that have more than one owner, I would usually recommend that you set it up as a limited liability company taxed as a partnership until you need a different tax structure. By the time that you need a different tax structure, you are probably making enough money to hire an attorney and an accountant to figure that out for you. There's about 10 minutes left, and I know that Tara wanted to do a little bit of wrap up, and I wanted to leave some extra time for questions about for-profit. Does anybody have any questions? And it looks like in chat, there's a recommendation for insurance. Gallagher.
I have a question if no one else does.
Yeah.
Okay. So aside from the art house, I have my own studio practice, and it is an LLC. And I am about to embark on a project that I'm going to be paying a couple artists, one to do video, one to be my mentor or whatever, and one to be my mentee, you know, like an assistant. So these are limited independent contractors. Is my LLC sufficient for this limit? It's just a project, it's not ongoing.
You're going to have written contracts with the people that you're hiring.
I will make an appointment with you.
I mean, if you have written contracts with them that's clarifying that they are independent contractors and not owners, then yes, you're probably sufficient. Where we get nervous is if people start doing stuff and they've not had a clarification of what the relationship of the parties is in writing. It's only a problem if somebody sues somebody, because I mean, if nobody's suing somebody, nobody cares, right? But if there's not been a clarification of the relationship and then someone sues, then sometimes courts will deem that there was a partnership, and then they'll impute taxes and responsibilities on the basis of that.
That's the reason you get an agreement. Okay, so I'll get agreement.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, that and to help protect yourself, so that if they do something, they're responsible, they're indemnifying you. They're basically saying, if I get sued for doing something stupid, and you also, Nicole, get sued for me doing something stupid, I'm going to indemnify you so that you are not responsible for my stupidity.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Tara, Mariah, did I hit all the things you wanted me to?
Yeah, I think
and in a
so.
very entertaining fashion. So thank you.
It looks like you're at the tiny desk stage.
That is my background, is the NPR Tiny Desk.
Oh, I didn't realize it's not real. I'm such an idiot. Okay.
No, when the pandemic first started, NPR released a bunch of different backgrounds from them, and this was one of them. And I religiously watched the Tiny Desk concerts.
Yes.
Some of them I've watched embarrassingly more times than I'm willing to admit. and so I was like, oh, I can just look like I'm at the Tiny Desk all the time. Yes.
Seriously, I thought that was your background. I mean, I thought that was your house. I have another question because I'm obnoxious and I'm sorry.
Oh, no,
So-
I don't think you're obnoxious.
Okay, so I have, obviously, I have three entities. I'm working at the art house. I have my personal self and money, and then my studio art. So I am started in Quicken, and I think I'm switching over to QuickBooks. Because like I was advised to, and then you mentioned Mint and my head exploded. So I'm just wondering, what's the relationship between when forget the art house for a second, just me and the studio arts business, keeping track and that firewall between your personal and business expenses. Do you have a
Yeah.
recommendation regarding QuickBooks and Mint again?
So Mint is a lot more limited because you're not paying for it. It's free. So, I mean, if you're doing like a business, one business and one personal, and you don't have, 300 transactions a month, Mint is probably, doable. Once you start getting into more complicated stuff, because you're not paying for it, you start to like kind of be bumping up against the limitations of what the system can do for you. So at that point, you're probably, QuickBooks or Quicken is probably going to be more robust. Now, QuickBooks and Quicken are the 300-pound gorillas in the market, right? I mean, they're what everybody uses, but there are other programs out there that are not Intuit-based programs. The advantage of that is they're usually cheaper. The disadvantage of that is that nobody really knows them. So if you're trying to take them to an accountant, sometimes the accountants are like, what is this? I only work with QuickBooks. So, I mean, that's kind of one of the things. But I think, Nicole, if you were trying to do Mint with trying to keep 3 lines separate, I think that might be frustrating with Mint.
Okay, good. I would like to ignore Mint. Thank you.
So, I mean, that's just my personal opinion. And Allison said, if you start in Mint and decide you want to do QuickBooks, do you know if you can just transfer the information over? My understanding is you can, because it's an Intuit product. So you can basically export and import, but don't 100% quote me on that. Any other questions?
Awesome. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Danny. That was amazing. I just want to briefly remind everyone, I don't know because I haven't looked lately at who's working on their draft for inspiration, but if you are working on a draft for the inspiration grant, the deadline is April 3rd. If you haven't started yet and you're like, what is that? I'm really interested. I'll send a link in the chat. Basically, this year, they're $2,500 grants for individual artists or small groups of artists who either are wanting to do a project that's very transformational to their career, and or it's something that has a positive community impact. So I put a link in the chat. If you have any questions about the inspiration grant, let me know. But again, the deadline is April 3rd. We have a lot of great resources on the website in terms of the application is on there, so you can see what questions it asks. You can see how it's evaluated. So we do try to be pretty transparent with all of that. So hopefully the website is helpful. If you look at that and you find can you pair inspiration grant with MA? Somebody asked us this last time, I think, and I'll repeat my answer. I think Mariah had something to add too, but as far as from ArtsKC point of view, yes, you can pair inspiration with other funding, and we hope that you do. Or I guess we should say we encourage that, because the more funding for your project, the better. And I think typically, maybe this is what you said last time, Mariah, typically with grants, funders want to fund what other funders want to fund. They want to match, they want matching funds. They want to know that other people are investing in you too. So the more, the merrier, in my opinion, but I'm not super familiar with any stipulations on the MAA innovation side. So you might check with them too. But as far as from us, of course, yeah, we'd love for you to get as much money as you can.
But it is not, we no longer require matching funds in any of our grant categories. So it's great if you want to put it into your budget, that just as Tara said, tells the committee members that there's more than one organization that has found this to be a great project, but it's definitely not required.
But yeah, okay, so any other, I guess I should open it up. Any other questions about inspiration while I'm here? Okay, well, now you know me, and you know I'm a person, I don't bite. So feel free, if you think of any questions, send them my way. I'm happy to jump on a phone call too with anybody if you want to talk some stuff out. But after this, I will send an email either today or maybe tomorrow with the link to this recording, a link to a survey, and the survey asks you about both the last workshop we had last week on budget prep and this week. And if you only went to one or the other, that's fine. You can fill it out accordingly. So we'd love to hear your feedback. And I'll also send the contact information for me, for Danny, and for Phyllis and Mariah too. So if you have any questions for any of us, and I can include Chris on that too, if you'd like, Chris, our budget prep expert. So I'll send all of our contact information out. So if you have any further questions that you think of later, you can send them to us. Anything else before I send you off on this beautiful St. Patty's Day? Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.